Hello and welcome. I hope you guys are enjoying the reference video so far. Now, I will admit I am not perfect. Final Fantasy XIV is such a massive game and there are things I will overlook, things I got wrong, and as the game continues to be updated, new references that will surface. To make up for this, in today's video, I'm going to do a quick overview of what is new, what I missed, and what I got wrong in the Final Fantasy reference series. But before we get started, if you haven't watched the series, I would definitely recommend you watch those videos first before watching this one. And also, this will not cover everything I missed. There are definitely more references than I thought, so there will be a part 2 of this video. I thought dividing the video into parts would make things a lot easier. And as always, this will cover references up to patch 6.15, including major story references, so consider this your spoiler warning. And with that, let's start with Final Fantasy I. When you start your adventure in Final Fantasy I, you have a choice from 6 jobs. These are the Warrior, Monk, Thief, Black Mage, White Mage, and Red Mage. All of these jobs are present in Final Fantasy XIV. The Rogue class in Final Fantasy XIV is very similar to the Thief class in Final Fantasy I. However, I mistakenly call it a job. Rogue is known as a class in Final Fantasy XIV. However, the upgrade, Ninja, is a job that mirrors the Final Fantasy upgrade from the Thief. Tiamat and Kraken are 2 of the 4 fiends that actually exist in Final Fantasy XIV. However, in Final Fantasy XIV, they exist as separate entities and are unrelated to each other, unlike the 2 in Final Fantasy I, where they are part of the 4 fiends. Watt's Anvil is a location in Lakeland where the Dwarf Beastmen tribe reside. Watts is a dwarf that exists in Final Fantasy I. Namely, he's the dwarf that exists in Melmond that decided to explore the world outside Mount Duergar. Although Matoya was not blind in Final Fantasy XIV, her apprentice Ishtola is blind and temporarily takes up the Matoya name in Shadowbringers. And during the Heavensward main story quest in Final Fantasy XIV, you are tasked to find Matoya's Crystal Eye, which is a reference to her quest in Final Fantasy I, which also takes you to find Matoya's Eye. And finally, we have several mobs in Final Fantasy XIV that got their original appearance in Final Fantasy I, such as the Mind Flayer and Sahagins. And in Shadowbringers, the Goblin model is based off the original goblins in Final Fantasy I. Now, we can't also forget the new model that appeared in Endwalker. This model is based off the War Mech in Final Fantasy I. There is also the Wind-Up Furion, a minion that can be bought at the achievement shop in New Gridania. Jonathas is in Old Gridania, not New Gridania. Cid and the Chocobos also make their first appearance in Final Fantasy II. The Ultima spell that was used in the main story quest made its first appearance in Final Fantasy II as the ultimate spell to help stop the Empire. The Garlean Dreadnought is named after the Palametian airship, the Dreadnought. The weapon Balmung bears a resemblance to the weapon that Firion uses on the box art for Final Fantasy II. And finally, the name Wild Rose makes another appearance as the Red Mage artifact weapon in Endwalker. Five-headed dragon. So first off, that is a sprite of the 2-headed dragon, even though on screen, the 5-headed dragon is the one that appears in the World of Darkness raid. Although the 5-headed dragon is supposed to be a more powerful version of the Final Fantasy III boss, the actual 2-headed dragon appears as a trash mob at the beginning of the raid dungeon. Now before we end, we also need to talk about one more fight, Eden's Promise Umbra. In an attempt to balance out the light that your character favors towards, you summon the Embodiment of Darkness. you take on another form of the Cloud of Darkness. This time, they take on their Dissidia form. This model of the Cloud of Darkness actually comes from the Amano art of the Cloud of Darkness, not from Dissidia. Now, I'll let Redditor ThatGuy264 explain these next ones. I skimmed through the video. There are two references that are understandably missed due to them not making it to the localization. The Onion Knight reference has a reference to Lunith in the Japanese version item description. Specifically, it says the name is stamped on the bottom of it. Second, one of the Warriors of Darkness is referred to as a knight in his title. The Japanese version instead calls him a dark/demon knight, specifically using the Final Fantasy III's term for it. The adorable Moogles make their first appearance in Final Fantasy III. While 3 of the 4 original bosses from the World of Darkness are found in the dungeon of the same name in Final Fantasy XIV, the 4th boss, Echidna, can be found at the end of the Void Ark raid dungeon. Desh and Selena, who are characters that first appeared in Final Fantasy III, make a mention in Final Fantasy XIV. Desh is known as one of Grahatia's ancestors, and his background is heavily based around the Crystal Tower, and Princess Selena is mentioned in the quest On the Shoulder of Giants. The Xande clone that appears in the World of Darkness first is locked in a chest and only appears after opening it. This is very similar to how Xande clones appear in Final Fantasy III. And finally, in Endwalker, it has come to light that Amon from the Circus Tower raid has a much more prominent role as Fandaniel. In fact, we see a new model that is based off of Amon at the end of the Itioscope dungeon. The battle theme of this area is the Battle Theme 1 from Final Fantasy IV, directly from the NES version. I mistakenly say NES instead of SNES. Kane's armor is also in Final Fantasy XIV in the form of a Realm Reborn artifact armor. This armor is obtainable starting at level 45 through the main story quests. The artifact armor actually comes from job quests, not the main story quest. 2 minions I forgot to mention were the Spoony Bard minion and the Mega Sisters minion. The Spoony Bard minion comes from purchasing the Heavensward soundtrack, and the Mega Sisters comes from the Tower of Zot. In the main story quest in A Realm Reborn, there is a spy known as Codename Hummingway. Hummingway is a reference to the race of moon bunnies in Final Fantasy IV. And finally, in the main story quest of 6.1, a Knight in Black and 4 mysterious elemental beings make their first appearance in Final Fantasy XIV. These are known as Golbez and the 4 Fiends from Final Fantasy IV. Next is Twintania, which can be found in Turn 5 of the Binding Coils of Bahamut. Although I did say that Twintania appears in Turn 5 of the Binding Coils of Bahamut, this is only a reference in name. The model of Twintania can be seen as the boss fate in The Tempest, and again at the end of the melee role quest in Endwalker. This next reference was much more clever than I first realized. Not only is the Tycoon a reference to Final Fantasy V, it also references the ruler of Tycoon, Alexander Highwind Tycoon, using the Alexander model to further reinforce the reference to the original leader. Califistri also appears as a minion from the Weeping City of Mach. There is an item called the Job Mastery Prism, which shows 3 stars above your character. This is a reference to the Job Mastery icon from Final Fantasy V. And finally, a reference I intentionally omitted was the old cross-class system. For those who started after Stormblood, the role action system used to be the cross-class system, much like the one in Final Fantasy V. you were able to take abilities from other classes, again, much like Final Fantasy V. However, this was ultimately replaced by the role action system in Final Fantasy XIV, as there were many cross-class abilities that just ended up being mandatory for mid and high-level play. The devs implemented the role actions to streamline the abilities used for each role. The former king, Cyan, references Cyan, the ruler of Doma. Cyan is the retainer to the ruler of Doma, not the actual ruler. Also, I've always saw his name like the color Cyan, but it only dawned on me while making this video that it could have been pronounced the same way as the Japanese name, Cyan. So let me know how you guys say his name. The Mesitian Rabbit from Ninja made its first appearance in Final Fantasy VI as one of Setzer's slot abilities. The Falcon Mount is named after Setzer's airship from Final Fantasy VI. And finally, Ultros and Typhon also appear as a minion and a mount respectively. The airship that Biggs and Wedge owns is known as the Tiny Bronco, which is named after the airship that Sid owned in Final Fantasy VII. The Samurai Idol pose has a striking resemblance to one of Sephiroth's pose. The Dark Knight Battle and Victory pose are based off of Cloud's victory and his normal stances in Final Fantasy VII. And the church at the bottom of the lake is a potential reference to the church in Sector 5, which also includes a hole on the top of the roof. Following the release of Final Fantasy VII, Square Enix had become one of the companies to look out for in the late 90s. Square Enix did not exist when Final Fantasy VIII came out. It was Squaresoft. In Final Fantasy VIII, Rinoa owns a dog named Angelo, and she has had him since her childhood. Angelo often accompanies Rinoa and even helps out in battle. Angelo is a girl, not a boy. And now we face off against Gaia. I mistakenly say that Eden's Promise is Gaia, when in reality it is both Metron and Gaia. Now, another reference about Metron, but I'll let the YouTube comments go over this. Eden's Promise takes the shape inspired by the statue of the Greek goddess Artemis, which also ends up being the name of Metron. This is a reference to Artemisia, who is usually translated from Japanese as Artemisa in most languages except English. It's debated whether or not Artemisia's name is mistranslated in English, since her name is pronounced as, and I'm sorry if I butcher this, Arutimeshia in Japanese, which can be interpreted in either way. The Ragnarok also makes another mention as the elegant ships that have a resemblance to the Ragnarok in Final Fantasy VIII. These can be seen in the Mare Lamentorium and referenced in the Binding Coil raids. There is an ability that Gunbreakers have in PvP known as Draw and Junction, which is a reference to the gameplay mechanics that appear in Final Fantasy VIII. And finally, during the Oracle of Darkness fight, she uses two other abilities that I failed to mention, Apocalypse and Time Compression, in the form of her relativity abilities. And there we have it so far. I know that there are so much more, and as stated at the beginning of the video, there will be a part 2 at the end of the series, but I just wanted to get these out of the way because I do genuinely feel bad for missing a lot of these, and I promise to do better in my research in the future videos. I also wanted to say, seriously, thank you guys for watching these reference videos. It has been fun to do these videos and just reliving the series that I hold dearly. Of course, with Final Fantasy XVI and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth on the way, it has been a treat to replay all the Final Fantasies before these big releases, and it's just an amazing time to be a Final Fantasy fan. Thank you guys again for watching, and I will see you in the next video.